When I was a kid, some of my favorite times were getting a canoe or getting in a tube and going down a river. One of our favorite places when I was a child growing up in Arkansas, in North Arkansas, there's a national park called Buffalo National Park, a very famous river that winds through semi-tall cliffs, and it's just a real easy water. It's not too fast, not too rapid. And to get a canoe and just get on the river and just float along, it was such an enjoyable time. It was always so peaceful and relaxing. It was in the middle of nowhere. No one was out there. It was easy to find places to be alone. You could float along and come upon a sandbar, get out, swim, and just enjoy yourself. I don't know if you enjoy those sorts of activities, canoeing or rafting or tubing or things like that, but the thing that, as I look back, that was interesting to consider is that the thing that propels you down the river are the currents and the winds that you never see. You can see the effects of the wind and the trees, but there's this unseen force that's continually propelling you as you float along. Today we're going to look at the life of Esther, and we're going to see many currents and winds, if you will, that are at work in her life. Things that are unseen behind the curtains that we're not always aware of. And forces that propel her from being born a simple child, a captive in Babylon out of her home country, thrust into being the queen of an entire empire. If you've got your Bible, we're going to look into the book of Esther, the first 4 chapters. We're continuing our study this summer of looking at some of the prominent characters of the Bible and what they have for us. If you don't have a Bible, welcome you to look into page 598. There's a Bible in the pews. We'll be spending some time in these first 4 chapters. As we go along, I want you to consider with me the outline that I have for us. Four things we're going to see about Esther's life. Number 1, we're going to see Esther's naivety. Number 2, we're going to see Esther's problem. Number 3, I want you to see Esther's dilemma. And finally, I want you to see Esther's resolve. So, naivety, problem, dilemma, and resolve. First, let's look at Esther's naivety. There's 2 scenes in particular that we're going to look at in chapters 1 and 2. Start with me, if you will, in verse 1 of chapter 1. Now, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. This is our first scene. We see the king, he's gathered at the palace with many different people. He's been giving a banquet for 180 days, or he's been receiving guests for 180 days, 6 months. Men and women from all over his empire. You heard it from India to Ethiopia. If you know your map, it's an expansive territory. So 6 months, all of these important figures in his administration coming in. He's basically having a big show. He seems to be pretty full of himself. He's showing off everything. They're having a big party. Finally, they cap this 6-month-long party, showing off, with 7 days of a banquet. Now, skip ahead to verse 11. He's having this banquet. Let me set it up just a bit. They're drinking and they're having a big party, and his queen Vashti is also having a party for the women that have come. Suddenly, he's there in the presence of, assuming, all these men, and he wants, I guess, to show off his queen. So he says, send for her, allow her to come in. We want her to come. Look at verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Sorry, I missed verse 11, didn't I? Let's pick up verse 11. He sent to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. So it appears that he wants to bring her in. He wants to show her off. She's beautiful. You can imagine all these men from all over the empire gawking at her because she's so beautiful. And what does she do? She flatly refuses. She refuses to come in and be shown off. Now, we don't know if this had ever happened before, that the king had ever been refused. I wonder sometimes if she felt like this would be somewhat like a county fair or a state fair where you go in and you just, all the animals, there they are, they're all lined up. The people have been doing their best to raise the animals, and they're just there to be shown off. Was she just there to be paraded before all these people? When she refused, the king became very angry. It says his wrath burned within him. You can imagine him thinking, even though it was his wife, no one refuses the king. Flash ahead to the next few verses. Ahasuerus gets together with all of his men, all of his nobles, all of his leaders, and he says, what are we going to do? If we allow this to continue, not only is this a big deal here, but women all over the empire will think that they can do this sort of thing to their husbands too. Very interesting, right? He's worried about all the other women. Look at verse 19 and let's see what they decide. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. So this is the first scene. They have a big party. The king wants his wife to come in and be paraded before the men. She refuses. The leaders come together and say, okay, let's get rid of her and let's find you a queen who will do whatever you want. In chapter 2, as we move ahead, they decide to have an empire-wide beauty contest. They say, go and find women from all over the empire. We'll line them up and we'll let you choose the one that best suits you. This is what they decided to do. So this begins to happen. This is scene number 1. Scene number 2 begins in verse 5 of chapter 2. So in the first scene, we have the king and the queen. We have the leaders. We have a refusal from Queen Vashti. In the second scene, we come in contact with Esther. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So what we see is that the family of Mordecai, a few generations back, had been deported out of Jerusalem into Babylon. And so now we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther, Apparently, Esther's parents have died at some point, and Mordecai has adopted her, his cousin, into his family. Apparently, there must have been some distance in age between the two, and so he took her as his own daughter, and he raised her. And then the key thing that begins to introduce us to Esther. She was a young lady, beautiful of form and of face. The author of Esther is telling us that she was very attractive and she had a nice figure. So this is the scene of Esther being introduced, and now the two are going to come together, scene 1 and scene 2. Look at verse 8. So it came about when the command and the decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. So the call has gone out across the whole empire, bring in beautiful women from all of the empire for the king to choose a new queen. The author of Esther doesn't tell us how Esther was chosen, how she was selected to be one of the candidates, but we find that now she's taken into the citadel, and she's going to prepare for this big beauty contest. Now it's interesting, in verse 10, something else that the author wants us to see. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. We don't know yet. Would that be a problem if her ethnicity were known? Is anti-Semitism already at work in the kingdom? Would it be a problem if she revealed that she was a Jew? Did the king only prefer aristocratic women from noble families, of which she was not? That's what one commentator suggested. We don't know. One after another, as things go along, every woman is brought before the king. And look at what happens in verse 15. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, had taken her as his daughter, came to go in to the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther found favor. One of the things that we see throughout all of the Old Testament is we find this idea of finding favor. Oftentimes, it's used of God, that he shows his favor on those who do not deserve it. His loving kindness, his favor. And here Esther has found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. The interesting thing about the book of Esther, you never find the name of God anywhere in the entire book. I believe it's the only book in the whole Bible where you never find God's name. And yet we see these elements of God's purposes and God's character and how he works, causing Esther to find favor in the eyes of all who saw her. She found favor with the king, and she becomes the replacement for Vashti. Now here's what's interesting. Esther has gone from being a nobody to suddenly being elevated to the queen. She's not yet a person of great influence, but God has placed her into a place, a very important position, so that when the time comes, she can be used of him. The preceding years and events of her growing up and being in the house of Mordecai, it was all preparation for what was coming. In a sense, she was not yet doing all that God had created her to do. God was preparing her to do even more than she had been doing in a life that was coming. Just like tubing or rafting, canoeing down a river, being driven by forces that you can't see, God is catapulting Esther into a place of prominence, a day in which God was preparing to use her. Nothing as of yet in the kingdom had put the Jews in danger. And yet God was already at work preparing the solution. Now here's the application for us to think about from point number 1 of Esther's naivety. As you consider the circumstances of Esther here at the beginning of the book, you can see that it appears she's just floating along. She didn't seek this position as the queen. She didn't go out looking for it, but suddenly she was thrust into it. As readers of the text, we see all that's happening. We see the Lord at work in her life, and we see him at work in these circumstances, in these events. We see him at work in Mordecai's life, in the king's life, in the man in the citadel that was over the ladies, Hegai. We see God at work in his life. She found favor with him. And so God is at work in many different ways, in many different places already in the book. Did you know that just like Esther, there are hundreds of things that the Lord is doing in and around you right now? Have you ever thought about that? There's things that you can't see. There's things you're not aware of. You don't even perceive them because they haven't come to fruition yet in your life, and yet God is at work. Some of them don't involve you, not yet. He's working in the lives of your neighbors, in the lives of your family members, in the lives of other brothers and sisters here. Some of the things that the Lord is doing, he's orchestrating for you and I to be a part of. There will be a time when someone will enter into your life, or you'll enter into their life, and they will need your help, or they may have a question about your behavior. They'll see that you're different, and they'll want to know, hey, why are you like that? Why do you always show up on time at work? And you always leave on time. You never cut corners. You don't steal from the boss. They may ask you, like I was asked when we lived in Indonesia, hey, when you're away from your wife on a business trip, why don't you cheat on her? Just like all the other men do. Why are you faithful to her? What makes you different? Or they may ask more plainly, why are you a Christian? Why do you follow Jesus? Now the question is, for all of us, when those moments come, and they will come, are you prepared to be used by God? Because you don't want to wait until that moment to suddenly realize, I don't know what to do. Are you prepared to be used? If you're not, are you preparing yourself now? You can get preparation now. Do you need more training? Do you need to learn how to share your faith? Do you need to be in a discipleship relationship with someone that's older than you, that's more mature, that can help challenge you and help you grow spiritually? God is going to use you. He's going to provide these moments of crisis to insert you into a situation, and he wants to do it to use you. The second point in our outline is Esther's problem. We see her naivety, meaning her ignorance, her unawareness. She had no idea these things were happening around her. And now we're going to see her problem. Look at chapter 3. Verse 1, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Esther had become queen in chapter 2. Towards the end of the chapter, we saw that, well, what happened was there was an assassination plan that cropped up. Mordecai let Esther know about the assassination plan. She goes to the king and lets him know, and the king is saved. And then suddenly we find out at the beginning of chapter 3 that a man named Haman has been promoted. He's been advanced. He's been given authority above all the other princes in the land. it appears that he has become the number 2 in the kingdom behind the king. And so, as we read, the king requires all of the servants, all of the civil servants, all the other government officials, everyone who's there, that they are to bow down to Ahasuerus and pay homage, to Haman, and bow down to him. It's interesting. Look again at the end of verse 2. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Literally, it means to bow down and to worship. Haman wanted to be worshiped, and the king had consented that he would let it be. Now there's a crisis. Mordecai refuses. What happens next? Look at verse 3. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, meaning to Mordecai, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. So day after day, there Mordecai is with the other civil servants. Apparently all of them bow down and pay homage to Haman. And Mordecai is the single man that resisted, that wouldn't do it. The reason he gives is because he told them he was a Jew. He said, we're not allowed to do that, basically. Mordecai was a very faithful man that wanted to follow God. This prostration that they were asking him to do, to worship another man, it was explicitly forbidden of followers of God to do that. If it was done to someone else other than God, then it was considered idol worship. Listen to Exodus 20. You've heard this many times. These are the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them, same word as our paying homage. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the 3rd and the 4th generations of those who hate me. So Mordecai, a faithful Jew, says, I will not do this. This is idol worship. I cannot bow down and worship another man. I worship Yahweh God alone. Well, word gets back to Haman. What do you think will be his response? Look at verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with wrath. Literally, he was full of poison. He was full of poison. He couldn't stand that everyone else bowed down to him, but Mordecai would not. And watch what happens next. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. You can imagine that all of Haman's yes men, all of these other civil servants that were in competition with Mordecai to be advanced and to get a better job, to be yes men, to kiss up to Haman, were telling him, just kill him, just get rid of him. But Haman says, or the author tells us that Haman disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Literally, it means that was beneath him. I can imagine him saying to the other men, men, you're so small-minded. That's too easy to kill just one man. Listen to the translation that the Message gives, that gives us some more meat here in this verse. Haman hated to waste his fury on just one Jew. That gets at the essence of the text. He discovered that Mordecai was a Jew. What the text doesn't tell us is that Haman was a descendant of the king of Agag of the Amalekites. The Amalekites and the Jews had been sworn enemies for several centuries. And now here you have Haman, the number 2 man in the kingdom, who's got his shot not only at Mordecai, but to wipe out all of his enemies. Haman hated to waste his fury on just one Jew. This was bigger than just one person. Look at the end of 6. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. This wasn't just about one man. This wasn't just about the Jews that lived in Susa. He wanted all of them, all of his enemies. And so he didn't want just Mordecai. Now let's flash back to the early part of chapter 2, when Esther is being brought into this beauty contest. What does Mordecai tell her? Don't tell them who you are. Don't tell them your ethnicity and your background, that you are a Jew. Maybe Mordecai had begun to see Haman's rise to power, and he knew he was a descendant of the Amalekites, their sworn enemies. We don't know. But what the writer of Esther wants us to feel right now is he wants us to feel the tension of what's happening. Esther has no idea this is going on. We know. Haman is filled at wrath with the Jews. He wants to wipe them out. Esther has been queen now for 5 years, and she has no idea of this plot. And then Haman goes to the king to work out all of the details. Look at verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business, to put in the king's treasury. You see what he says? He goes to the king. He makes up this reason. Hey, there's these people in your kingdom. They don't follow you. They don't care about your laws. They just want what they want. In fact, I'm willing to pay out of my own pocket. Apparently, Haman was a very wealthy individual. He said, I'll tell you what, there won't even be any expense for the king or for his government. I take all of this upon myself, and I'll pay for it. But these people must be destroyed. The king consents, and now the die is cast on what will happen. The writer, again, wants us to feel right now the tension. There's this subplot going on, and the king has just signed the death warrant for his newly crowned wife. Listen to what all he consents to in verse 13. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the people so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa, and while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. So Haman establishes a month. He establishes a day that's to come, sends out the word to all the provinces, lets all the governing officials know that there's a day coming. We're going to wipe these people out. Here's Esther's problem. The Jews have been targeted for destruction, with the king, her husband's explicit permission. And Esther's true identity will be revealed. We move to the third part of our outline, and we find Esther's dilemma. We pick up in chapter 4, verse 3. We just read that the city of Susa was in confusion. And then verse 3 of chapter 4, in each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai and all the Jews are mourning and fasting. They're weeping and wailing, not only in Susa, but across the entire empire. We're not told exactly how far there is in advance to this day, how much time there will be before this happens. But Mordecai has gone to the city square in the middle of the city to mourn and sit in sackcloth. Esther hears of it. She doesn't understand what he's doing. She sends an attendant, go out there and find out, what is he doing? What's going on? Apparently, word has not gotten back to her. She has not heard about this edict that has gone forth. Look at verse 7 of chapter 4, after she sends the attendant out there to check on Mordecai. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him, this is the attendant, a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go in to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Verse 9. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. Okay, so this is Esther now sending word back to Mordecai as he's mourning. Verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. This is the dilemma fully revealed to us. What should she do? These are her people. This is her husband who has consented to this murderous extermination plot. And she just now finds out. What does she say? She says, what can I do? I can't just show up to see the king. The king doesn't allow visitors unannounced. If you do, it's on pain of death. In fact, I haven't seen him in 30 days. We haven't had any contact, no conversation. I don't know if he's angry with me. I don't know what's happening. If I go in unannounced, I could be killed, Mordecai. These all seem to be very good reasons, right? They're logical. They're true. But listen to what, as a Mordecai, how he responds. Look at verse 12. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? She sends her reply to Mordecai. You can imagine he's shocked. Here she is in the greatest place to have an impact. He pleads with her, and she sends back her reply. Now listen to his reply. He says, these are all excuses, and they're not very good ones. You're the queen, yes, but you're a Jew just like us. Do you think that living in the palace with the king is going to save you when he finds out your identity? Neither you nor your relatives will escape this wicked plan. And listen, if you don't take action right now, if you don't step up, when you've got the chance, when you're in a position to do something, then God will provide someone else besides yourself. He'll raise them up, and they'll provide deliverance. Have you not considered that God may have put you on the throne of this entire empire for such a time as this, a crucial time in the life of our people? You've been given your position to be used by Him. That's my paraphrase of what Mordecai was expressing to Esther. And now God says to you and to me that He has put you in positions in your life to stand for Him, to give voice for Him. God has more opportunities that He will bring along for you to speak for Him, for you to show His love, to share about His Christ and salvation. He's going to put you in places, in unique places, that the person beside you, the person behind you, that your pastor has no access into. God has uniquely shaped each of you. He's shaped your life situation, where you work or where you reside in retirement, where you live, the neighbors that you're close to, the coworkers that you bump up next to their cubicles, or you meet them at the coffee maker in the mornings. God has given you and I a platform into people's lives that others don't have, so that you and I can be uniquely used. Think about the people that you relate to regularly. How does the Lord want to use you? Maybe you're thinking, I'm retired, I live at home, I don't go out much, I don't have much contact with other people. Think about the activities you do. Sometimes you go to restaurants. You go to your mailbox and you say hello to your neighbor. There's a relationship there. People deliver things to your home. Maybe you have a yard service. There are all of these points of contact that oftentimes we go, well, I don't really know anybody. But your unique situation, God is going to use you right where you are. We have fun and it's exciting to go to North Carolina and to do a mission trip and to minister there. But you don't have to go anywhere to be on mission. Your mission exists all around you, right where God's placed you. Esther had all of these events that she had no idea she was being propelled into. And suddenly, she had a platform. You and I are no different. God is at work doing thousands of things around us and in us and through us. And He wants to use you right where you are. Esther was the only follower of God that we're aware of that had direct access to the king. Did you know that there's people in your life that you may be the only follower of Christ that they'll ever know? Are you going to be used by Him? Are you going to use your influence and your relationship in that person's life to speak for Christ? Listen, I confess to you that I am just like Esther. It's easy to think of the why I can'ts and the what ifs, and to think of excuses of why I can't do something, why I can't speak for the Lord, or why the person will say this, or and we just find ourselves thinking about the circumstances. Brothers and sisters, we need to just leave the circumstances to God. He's big enough to handle all of the circumstances, all of the potential outcomes. He can handle it. Is there anything holding you back from consistently being used by God? Is it fear? Is it not knowing what to say, or afraid not to say the right things at the right moment? God can handle that too. Is it fear of rejection? That if I speak a word about Christ, they may be finished with me? Is it pride? I don't want to look foolish. I don't want somebody to think I'm one of those Bible thumpers, or that I'm some wacko fanatical Christian. Make your commitment today to let God set you free of any of the excuses and to be prepared to be used by God. Let's look at the final part of our outline. Number 4, Esther's resolve. We see her excuses. We see Mordecai come back and say, that's not good enough. You've got access. You're right there with the king. If it's not you, God will raise somebody else up. Look at verse 16. What does she say? Okay, go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. In other words, seek the Lord's face so that I might know what to say. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. What does she say? Okay, I've got to act. I'll do it. I'll go in. If I perish, I perish. She's resolved that the consequences don't matter. She's willing to lay her relationship, she's willing to lay her life on the line and leave the outcome with God. She was willing to be used by God. Now let me give you the quick end of the story if you don't know what happens in Esther. She goes in. The king is pleased to see her. He receives her. She pleads for her people. She lets him know about the plot that's going on. The king is obviously enraged at Haman. And the Jews are all saved. And Haman is the one that's hanged. Listen, God in this book, in these days of the Jews, He used an outsider in the Persian kingdom. A Jew, a woman, to rescue His people. The resolution for Esther was to take a stand and be used by God. It was extremely risky, but she decided, I'll be the one. As we wrap up, just a few questions. When the time comes and you are put on the spot for your faith, will you step into the moment and be used, or will you shrink away? Will you be a mouthpiece for Christ? where you are, where you live, where you work, the people you come in contact with. It doesn't have to be the 4 spiritual laws from first to end the whole time. Are you willing to speak a word for Christ? Listen, God longs to use his people. He's eager to use you right where you are. And there's no coincidences with God. There's not a coincidence where you live, not a coincidence where you work. The neighbors on either side of you, there's no coincidence there. Where your kids play ball, where they do ballet, where you're a member at the Y, the restaurants you frequent, the wait staff that you see each week. God is at work orchestrating events in your life for his glory, placing you in certain situations, in certain places, and when the time comes for you to announce who you are, will you boldly trust him and leave the consequences to him? Maybe you're here today and God has been orchestrating circumstances, events for you to be here and to hear about Christ. You've never heard about Jesus. You never heard these things about God. And you're here, and God wants you to know that he loves you. And he wants you to be faced with an opportunity to know him. What will you do? Will you follow him and give your life to him and surrender it? If you're a brother or sister, won't you make the commitment today to be used by God, or to renew that commitment to be used by him? Let's pray. Lord, we see in the book of Esther, we see in our own lives that, Father, you're at work. There's no accidents. You're giving us opportunities every day to be your witnesses, to be your mouthpieces, to let our lights shine before other men. Lord, I pray for my brothers and sisters that we would commit to being used by you. Lord, I just confess to you in front of my brothers and sisters that there's times I don't know what to say. And there's times I want to shrink back and just be in a corner and be insignificant. Father, would you forgive me? Lord, if we would be willing, you would use us in ways that we could never imagine. Father, would you help us commit today to being ready, to being eager, not knowing what the situation will look like, not knowing what the outcome will be, but to be used by you, Father. Father, if there's one here today that didn't know why they were here or how they got here, Father, and yet they have an opportunity to hear about you, to hear the message about your love and your salvation. Father, would you speak into their hearts? Would you reveal to them your love and your mercy? Would you reveal to them their need for you, Father? And I pray they would give their lives to you and just surrender.